Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this event 1 year on the forefront of the COVID-19 response, organized by the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, together with the governments of Germany and Canada. My name is Sarah Almer, and I am the Humanitarian Director of ActionAid International, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator for this event. We have an esteemed list of speakers ready, including our partners from the forefront of crisis that we will be hearing directly from. And we will be moving on with the agenda, starting from where we are, looking into the future and next steps, and the important role that women's organizations have, both in the shorter term to response to humanitarian crisis and issues of conflict, but also to longer term recovery. The event will be recorded and available publicly afterwards. And if you have any questions or want to contribute to the discussion in any way, please use the Q&A and the chat box. And we will try to keep that going as we move along. Be sure also to engage in our social media discussion. You can follow us on @WPHFund and also use our event hashtag Women Respond to Crisis. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce His Excellency Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations, Richard Arbeiter, who will be delivering the opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund for organizing this important event. Canada is very proud to be co-sponsoring it alongside Germany and Australia. I got to say I'm a bit sheepish being asked to deliver introductory remarks with this group of fantastic women here. I realize that as a private citizen, I'm a global beneficiary of your work. And I also happen to represent a government that genuinely values the critical work that you're doing. And I'm here to really deliver two messages, a message of awe and appreciation and a message of support and solidarity. Women and local women's organizations have been at the forefront in the battle against COVID-19. Women combat COVID-19 within their communities as frontline workers, as caregivers, as advocates, and very importantly, as peace builders. Local women's organizations are educating communities about containing and preventing the spread of COVID-19 and are providing life-saving services to men, women, and children. Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing every day of this unbelievably challenging year, no matter where you are. To continue this critical work, these women's organizations require our continued support. Political support, of course, and platforms like this discussion that we have today are tremendous opportunities for us to gain insights from those who are on the front lines, but they also require financial support, including support to global COVID-19 response plans. According to a recent WPHF survey, 84% of local civil society partners reported that their organization's very existence is at risk due to a lack of programmatic and/or institutional funding for WPS and humanitarian action. This is where the solidarity message comes in. There is an urgent need to act now to accelerate funding for local women's organizations. The Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund is a fantastic, innovative partner which channels funds directly into the hands of the women and women's organizations that are on the front lines of some of the world's most challenging settings. The fund has mobilized millions and is directly impacting tens of thousands and has responded to the shifting context that the COVID-19 pandemic has created. In Canada, we're big fans of the funds. We're very proud to be one of the original supporters of the fund, providing over $7 million since 2016. It is through the support that the WPHF gives to women worldwide that we aim to meet the ambitious vision that UN Resolution 1325 laid out for us over 20 years ago, and to ensure that women are included where it matters most. But our support to the WPHF is only one of the ways we support local women's organizations. For example, we also recently announced a $5 million envelope solely dedicated to supporting women peace builders at the local and national level through national and local organizations. We do this in full confidence of the capacity of these organizations to act as powerful drivers of change who will help us all overcome the current pandemic and fully realize the women, peace, and security agenda. So once again, thank you for being with us. You have our support, you have our solidarity, and you have our appreciation. I look forward to learning from you today. Thanks very much, Sarah.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those encouraging words. Next, we will be hearing from Sarah Hendricks, who is the chair of the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund Funding Board, and also the Director of Program Policy and Intergovernmental Division at UN Women. And unfortunately, Sarah was not able to be with us here today, but she has recorded a message for us.
Dear representatives from civil society, member states, and the UN, it's really my honor to join you today as the chair of the board of the United Nations Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. I would first like to thank the governments of Australia, Germany, and Canada for co-hosting this event today, as well as all the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund funding board members for your generous support, your guidance, your partnership with the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund straight over the years. COVID-19 continues to impact our lives in really profound ways. In the dire context of fragility and conflict, where social cohesion is already undermined and services are much too limited, the devastation of this pandemic and its detrimental impact on women and their organizations is only amplified. In contexts of displacement, we have seen a really dramatic increase in violence against women and girls. 73% of women interviewed by the International Rescue Committee reported an increase in intimate partner violence, and 32% actually observed a growth in the levels of early and forced marriage. And even with this evidence, and even despite this evidence, COVID-19 responses often do not address the gendered impacts of the pandemic. CARE International undertook a survey, and that survey pinpointed the following, that 54% of countries that they surveyed have taken no action on gender-based violence, and 33% do not appear to have addressed sexual and reproductive health in their response. And despite the evidence, less than 0.1% of COVID-19 funding currently tracked actually reaches local and national actors directly. So when it comes to local women's organizations, their very existence is actually at stake due to such shifting grounds of funding priorities. In April last year, a Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund survey found that almost 30% of all respondents felt the existence of their organization was actually threatened due to the lack of funding. And today, the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund followed up that survey and found that 84% of respondents feel that their organization's existence is at risk due to lack of programmatic or institutional funding for women, peace and security and humanitarian action. But it's right in the midst of these complex situations and in the context of an increasingly shrinking space for civil society, women and youth, who are on the forefront of the COVID-19 response. They are stepping in where health, economic, and legal support is just not accessible. It's they who are providing comprehensive and lasting solutions in their communities. It's they who work across the humanitarian, human rights, peace, and security nexus to address both the immediate needs, but also the structural inequalities and the root causes of tensions and conflict. They are building resilience, mediating conflicts, and safeguarding social cohesion. And exactly 1 year ago today, the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund Board launched the COVID-19 emergency response window, really identifying the urgent need to support local women's organizations' efforts to respond to COVID-19 and its gendered impacts, as well as sustain the critical work of local women's organizations on the front line through institutional and programmatic funding. And I'm really delighted, absolutely happy to announce that through this flexible and rapid financing tool, the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund is already supporting over 60 organizations through 44 projects designed and implemented by local organizations in 18 countries around the world. Today, you will hear from some of the incredible women leading these projects, and I hope you will understand the crucial work they are carrying out in remote areas, facing conflict, facing humanitarian crises, where access to services and women's rights are alarmingly limited. It is more important than ever to finance women's civil society organizations in conflict and crises. It is essential to the work that we do together to safeguard their rights and their very existence and support their roles as peacemakers, caregivers, and equal decision makers. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the conversations ahead.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that message and for pointing out just how important it is for women's organization at the forefront of crisis and response to have vital funding to be able to lead and support the responses to their communities. We will now be moving on to hear about how COVID-19 is impacting some of those communities that have been supported through the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, and how it is disproportionately affecting women, girls, and women's organizations. So let's hear first from a few of those organizations on the ground, from Yemen, Colombia, Palestine, Nigeria, and Afghanistan.
El primer impacto ha sido el aumento de violencias contra las mujeres, ya que por las cuarentenas obligatorias las mujeres tenían que vivir con sus agresores las 24 horas del día, y eso también ha hecho que se dispare la violencia sexual contra las niñas.
The second thing I would like to talk about is on the issue of the loss of livelihood for the women. A lot of the women we work with actually are being supported with various livelihood models, and we give them capitals or grants for them to embark on income generating businesses. During the COVID-19, they could not, they didn't have sales because customers were not there. There was a lockdown, and so they had to start touching on the capitals. So at the end of the lockdown, we found that they had nothing left to continue with their businesses.
El tercer impacto tiene que ver con los servicios de derechos sexuales y reproductivos, ya que han sido de una u otra forma negados, porque todos los esfuerzos están unificados en los casos del COVID-19, y esto ha hecho que aumente los casos de embarazos no deseados.
هناك آثار طويلة المدى لجائحة كوفيد كوفيد-19 على المجتمع تتمثل في زيادة العنف القائم على النوع الاجتماعي كانتشار ظاهرة زواج الأطفال في المجتمع، فقدان العديد من النساء للوظائف نتيجة لقيام أرباب الأعمال بالتخلي عن العاملين نتيجة لتدهور الوضع الاقتصادي، وهذه الأسباب تؤثر بشكل كبير على المجتمع وفئاته خاصة النساء والفتيات.
Bueno, consideramos que si no tomamos medidas urgentes frente a los impactos que hemos venido hablando que afectan directamente la vida de las mujeres, pues eso significa que vamos a retroceder los avances que hemos tenido en equidad de género en Colombia.
Thank you to Patricia, Nashba, Maha, and Nafasgul for bringing up such insightful points. I think we would all agree that the women we just heard illustrate the complexity, but also the creativity in terms of solutions to some of the issues and problems that are facing them and their organizations on a daily basis. With that, I have the pleasure to introduce Mavek Cabrera Ballesa, who is the founder and CEO of the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders. And Mavek will be speaking to us around the COVID-19 effects on the women, peace and security agenda implementation, and what is it that we need to look out for in terms of also any potential backlash around women's rights in these contexts. The floor is yours, Mavek.
Thank you, Sarah. Greetings to all those who joined us in this important conversation. Thank you to the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, the governments of Australia, Canada, and Germany for hosting this important event. Our organization, the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders, through our localization of 1325 program, work in communities that are directly affected by violent conflicts and humanitarian emergencies. In these local communities, women are caught between the conflict and the pandemic. Many of them live through the fighting, the bombings, famine, and the epidemic of sexual violence. It is therefore in their DNA to be peace builders and humanitarian actors. For example, GNWP members in different countries, while working to implement the peace agreements and localize the national action plans on women, peace, and security, they lead relief operations, organize psychosocial counseling services for women who are increasingly subjected to domestic violence due to the lockdowns. They are speaking in community radios to disseminate factual information to stop the spread of the virus. And at the same time, they urge local populations to be aware of violent extremist groups who intensify their recruitment during this time. Last year, we partnered with the NYU, New York University Center for Global Affairs in a research titled, "The Pandemic Will Not Stop Us: The Impact of COVID-19 on Women's Peace Activism in Colombia, the Philippines, South Sudan, and Ukraine." The research actually validated most of the issues raised by our colleagues in the video from Yemen, Colombia, and Nigeria. So let me share with you some of our findings. One, the pandemic has delayed implementation of peace agreements, in particular their gender provisions. It also shifted women's peace advocacy to online spaces, impacted the membership of women's peace groups, and diverted organizational energies into humanitarian action. Second, the lockdown measures imposed by governments, while necessary to contain the spread of the disease, have made women's peace-building work more difficult and in some cases more dangerous. In contexts where peace-building is a matter of life and death, for example, women mediators playing critical roles in diffusing tensions and reducing armed clashes, this has created a dilemma for the women. As noted by a government official interviewed in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao in the Philippines, women in conflict-affected communities often refuse to follow prevention measures as they have more immediate and critical problems than the virus. In a similar vein, a peace activist interviewed in South Sudan alluded to the crisis of food insecurity caused by COVID-19 and loss of income for many, stating that we would rather die of COVID instead of hunger. In certain circumstances, continuing to demand full implementation of peace agreements or raising alert about their poor implementation can put women at an increased risk of violence due to abuse of government power and police brutality. Another finding is that changes in donor funding patterns have made peacebuilding work more difficult. The funding earmarked for women's organizations' peacebuilding programs have been diverted to support emergency health and humanitarian response. Having said that, I am grateful to our donors, such as Canada, who have given us some flexibility to modify our project budgets so that we can continue our peacebuilding work and mitigate the impact of the pandemic and advocate for women and youth leadership in COVID-19 response and recovery. And this is also where funding windows, such as the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund's COVID-19 emergency response window, become essential. We need funding mechanisms that are simple, fast, and flexible. We need them to recognize that women's rights organizations have different sizes and capacities, and they operate under diverse and precarious conditions. I would like to present these recommendations. 1, donors should review their funding policies, practices, and requirements, including eligibility criteria and reporting expectations, or at the very least, consider temporarily relaxing some of those requirements to make funding, including core funding, available and more flexible to women-led and youth-led organizations that work in local communities. 2nd, member states should heed the UN Secretary General's call to reduce military spending and increase investment in social infrastructures and public services as a foundation of human security. And by the way, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute just announced yesterday that global military spending increased to almost 2 trillion in 2020. Yes, this is happening. More war and defense expenditure amidst the pandemic. So my appeal to policymakers and the donor community is to recognize and support, including especially through funding, the unique perspective that women and youth peace builders bring to humanitarian action, including the response and recovery from this health crisis. Women peace builders and frontliners' response to crisis is long-term, but it's also immediate and life-saving. When we advocate for the effective implementation of peace agreements in South Sudan, we also facilitate immediate and adequate sexual and reproductive health care to women survivors of rape. When we train Rohingya women refugees so they can participate in decision-making in the refugee camp, we also provide protection for women who are vulnerable to rape and sex trafficking. Now tell me, how is that not urgent? And how is that not life-saving? Donors should invest in women-led peace building that incorporate humanitarian action, recognizing that peace building is a necessary component of a sustainable solution to any crisis. As Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in his 2020 Women, Peace and Security report to the Security Council, at its core, the Women, Peace and Security agenda is a crisis prevention agenda. Thank you. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that very clear elaboration around the need for flexible funding for frontline responders, and also looking at the unique role that women organizations in crisis play across both immediate life-saving and responding to long-term strategic needs. Thank you. Next, I will invite Jacqueline Hart to take the floor. Jacqueline is the Senior Director for Strategy on the Women's Refugee Commission. Jacqueline, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this really critical conversation. We at the Women's Refugee Commission have been working on the gendered impacts of crisis and conflict. We sit on the board of the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund and really applaud the initiative and all of the donors who have seeded and continued to fund this important mechanism for reaching women's rights organizations and their leadership in responding to COVID. As my colleagues have detailed and discussed different aspects of the gendered impacts of COVID-19, I want to speak a bit more specifically about some of the findings that have come out of research recently completed by the Feminist Humanitarian Network in 8 countries, as well as work done by the Women's Refugee Commission, specifically on sexual and reproductive health and rights in humanitarian contexts. The research by the Feminist Humanitarian Network was done in Bangladesh, Kenya, Lebanon, Liberia, Nepal, Nigeria, Palestine, and South Africa. And it was led by women's rights organizations, which I think is a key aspect of what we're hearing from colleagues here, which is their particular perspective on the impacts of COVID are really important to resource and understand and take up. Our research on sexual and reproductive health care and the impacts of COVID-19 were done with key informants across the global space of humanitarian nexus, and in particular case studies done in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, Borno State, Nigeria, and the cyclone affected areas of Mozambique. This research, of course, adds to a huge amount of evidence, as Sarah and many other colleagues have referred to here, about the gendered impacts of women and girls. And I want to really speak to the particular effects for women who are affected and fleeing conflict and crisis. The travel restrictions, including border closures, suspension of resettlement travel, and last-minute deportation, which leaves them stranded and are forced to stay in cramped makeshift shelters. We often hear the phrase a shadow pandemic, that COVID-19 has created a shadow pandemic of gender-based violence. In reality, this incidence of gender-based violence in all of its forms was a global crisis before, and as my colleagues have indeed well spoken to, the fact that this has been greatly exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. And I'll speak to some of these specific findings. This violence is physical, sexual, economic, and psychological. It is further heightened by access of marginalization, such as by age for adolescent girls and by disability. So for women and girls with disabilities who are affected by crisis and conflict. This deprivation and violence is occurring at the systemic, community, and family levels. And we need to pay attention to the ways in which this experience of deprivation and violence is impacting every facet of women and girls' lives. As my colleagues have referred to, these lockdowns have forced women into close proximity with perpetrators with limited respite. It has prevented women from accessing support and services such as helplines and shelters, which they would otherwise have access to. And due to being at home with perpetrators and the fact that government systems are themselves stretched to the limit and diverting resources to the COVID-19 pandemic, resources that would have been available are no longer, and they are shut during lockdown. One organization in Lebanon and the Feminist Humanitarian Network research reported that violence against women had increased by 60% and violence against children by 30% in the year from 2019 to 2020. An organization in Palestine highlighted the gravity of these acts. So the severity and type of violence has also shifted. Quote, violence has become more vicious. There are more than just the cases of light hitting. There is use of heavy objects. There are broken bones and hitting with metal rods. the systems that support women and girls in their families, in their communities, in their countries have been stretched to the limit. Ongoing incidents of GBV, including rape, organizations in South Africa have reported that while previous to COVID-19, there was a difficulty with getting police enforcement and response. And now there is an absolute lack of response and ability to access respite from violence in their homes and communities. My colleagues also commented on the economic impacts of COVID-19 on women and girls in conflict and crisis. In Bangladesh, a women's rights organization found that food and financial support is being withheld from women. So I think that it's within every aspect of COVID-19 and its impact, we really need to consider the gendered impact, the kinds of impacts that are really specific, heightened, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on economies and systems. In addition, research in Bangladesh has found that for some women who had not experienced violence, COVID-19 and the lockdown has led to new incidents and new experiences of violence that had not been experienced before. Quote, so imagine being stuck with your abuser 24/7, who is used to taking women as bait to relieve his nervous system. And this pandemic just gave him a better chance of doing the same. The economic issues that are the reality for displaced and crisis affected women, and the fact that they work largely in the informal economy, as our colleague in Nigeria referred to in the video, the loss of livelihood has been an extreme form of distress for communities and has led them to resorting to negative coping mechanisms, such as early marriage, reduced food consumption, and child labor. A women's rights organization in Bangladesh found that child early and forced marriages have increased amongst displaced communities in remote areas, where poverty-stricken families have used this as a mechanism to ease financial burdens caused by the crisis. At the same time, because the national systems have been stretched, law enforcement agencies and local administrators who would normally possibly have been able to been a recourse against child early and forced marriage have been busy coping with COVID-19, which means that there is literally no system other than women's rights organizations in communities to turn to. My colleagues have also referred to the critical disruption in life-saving services, such as sexual and reproductive health care. And Women's Refugee Commission did a study that I referred to at the beginning, looking at what is the impact of the full range of sexual reproductive health services. We found that it has been cut off largely, that the systems that were already stretched have been broken. So for example, if you can imagine that there is one midwife serving the maternal health care needs for a large community, and that midwife gets sick, it means that there is no maternal health care left in that community. This access or lack of access to healthcare is further exacerbated by marginalization. In Nigeria, a women's rights organization study that was funded by Feminist Humanitarian Network found that women with disabilities were excluded from reproductive health response, with one consequence of many being that some women consequently lost their pregnancies. There are also impacts on the supply chain. So contraceptive supply chains have been disrupted, which means that women and girls are even further unable to protect themselves from unwanted pregnancy, exacerbating the sexual violence that they're already subject to. Recovery plans to COVID-19 rarely include refugee, displaced, and stateless women, nor are they included in decision-making. We find in the research that they are often funded by INGOs as implementers, as opposed to decision makers, as the ones who need to be directly funded, such as the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund is doing. We do not yet know the long-term gendered impacts of interrupted access to services and necessities like food and education for crisis-affected women and girls. But we do know that women's rights organizations, especially those led by refugee women and girls and displaced women and girls, are currently providing the only lifeline to many displaced populations, including those that are already marginalized, such as LGBTQI people and people with disabilities. These organizations are best placed and best positioned, as we have seen throughout the pandemic, to provide innovative and direct help. They hold the trust of their communities. We call on donors to use mechanisms like the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund to contribute to urgently needed resources for displaced women and girls. While Western countries have been hit especially hard by the COVID pandemic, we need you to understand the urgent needs of refugee, displaced, and stateless women and girls and their representative organizations. They face discrimination and ongoing marginalization, the impacts of structural inequalities, and extremely dangerous conditions with what we anticipate to be multi-generational effects. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for those very vivid examples of the impact that COVID-19 has had on women organizations responding at the front line, both in terms of some of the acute situations and also the longer term structural inequalities and injustices that these organizations are battling. On that note, I want to introduce our next speaker, which is Funmi Balogun, who is the Chief Normative and Coordination Humanitarian Action with UN Women. And I would like to hear from you, Funmi, what in your view are some of the key learnings that we can take from the past year in terms of how we respond and address collectively some of these critical needs which are not new? And what does this mean in crisis and conflict settings? What needs to change? Over to you, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all panelists, and of course to all the participants. 2020 was unprecedented in two ways, as we know. We of course, we know about the pandemic, but also 2020 was the year that we actually did celebrate 25 years after Beijing Platform for Action. That was transformative, as you know, and game-changing in the series of actions that were recommended and put forward by member states and all stakeholders on gender equality. 2020 was also, unfortunately, the year that we had the pandemic, which threatened all the gains on equality, rights, access, and opportunities that women have fought for and protected over the last 25 years. As the previous speakers have said, COVID exacerbated humanitarian crisis across the world, and unfortunately also the gaps on inequality. Only 24% representation of women in global task, only 24% representation were women in global task forces on COVID, according to the UN Women and UNDP Global Tracker on Gender Equality. And of the 3,112 measures that were taken, actually, only half had, about less than half had gender sensitive measures, and they were primarily on violence against women and on economic empowerment, mostly actually on violence against women, which also speaks to a picture of how women were, the position of women during the crisis and even on the interventions. The interventions were primarily around protection. So women were still seen as victims rather than as leaders. Of course, this is directly correlated to the discussion today. What have we learned from this? Clearly, women's leadership in decision-making remain a challenge in development and humanitarian crisis. Nothing has changed, even COVID has not changed that. And if women's voices and perspectives are not present, then clearly their needs will not be a priority. I think that is what a lot of times when we talk about women's participation and influence in decision-making, I think what is missing is that when the voices are not there, when the people and the perspectives are not there, then the way you articulate the needs are going to be different. And so they're not going to be prioritized. The COVID response, while highlighting inequalities, did not change anything fundamental in the response. That humanitarian response has to interrogate its belief that needs are somewhat neutral, and human beings experience crisis the same way. I think that's a fundamental shift that needs to happen as we continue these conversations. Women and other vulnerable communities have consistently highlighted that needs assessments are about power. Power of those who determine whose needs are to be prioritized, to choose who to work with, and most importantly, to allocate resources. The other assumption is that those affected by crisis suddenly lose the unequal power relations in their communities when there is crisis. Existing gender and social norms, regardless of crisis, continues to be at play. Women and girls with intersecting factors and identities of oppression like disability, sexual orientation, etc., are often the most marginalized and discriminated against. And this does not change even when there's a crisis. This limits their abilities, as we know, to be part of decision-making in putting forward their needs, in assessing services that are appropriate, to provide critical feedback on the humanitarian and economic measures, and hold actors accountable. Not surprisingly, women's organizations and organizing continue to receive the least amount of resources to strengthen strategic engagement and actually build back better. So what can we do better? We need a recommitment to Beijing through the action coalitions, as we know, and the Compact on the Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action. That is pulling together again all the stakeholders, especially member states, to commit to actions in the next 5 years that will scale up not just funding, but investments to women's organizations in crisis settings, to strategic engagement that allows them to, at all levels, national, international, local, to participate in decision-making, to undertake appropriate needs assessment, to be in the forefront. Women's organizations need to be in the forefront of identifying their needs when there's an emergency and to define the priorities. Finally, we will need to change fundamentally the models and systems that we currently have in responding to emergencies. Mavic said something just when she started her statement, or in the statement, around even for women's organizations to be able to access resources. Recently, just last week, I was going through the criteria. There was a donor that had a funding opportunity out, and there for organizations, NGOs. And I went through the criteria and I thought to myself, there's no way in hell that local women's organizations will ever be able to access this funding. There's no way. There was just no way with all the requirements. So funding must move beyond life-saving to sustainability, and women's organizations must be at the core. A percentage of aid resources, and we must hold donors and member states accountable to this, must go to funds like the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, to the UN Trust Fund on Ending Violence Against Women, African Women Development Funds, funds that allow women's organizations to grow, to be flexible, to be strategic, practical, but also to be disruptive when there's need to be. These types of funds are the only pathways in which to sustain women's organization, which in turn puts power in the voices of the often discriminated and marginalized communities, to change the lives of the people while reducing inequalities and equities. So thank you once again for the opportunity, and look forward to the rest of the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Funmi, for those reflections. Without further ado, we will complement that by taking ourselves back to Colombia, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Palestine, and to hear from some of the women, peace, and humanitarian partners how they have worked to mitigate the impact of COVID on their communities.
عقد عدة لقاءات مع صناع القرار من أجل حثهم وإدماج ومشاركة النساء في خطط الطوارئ، وإقناعهم بأنه ضرورة وجود النساء في وضع الخطط، ووجودهم كمقدمات خدمات في مراكز الحجر، لأنهم هم أقدر فهما لاحتياجات النساء، بالإضافة إلى تبادل الخبرات.
Another thing we are also doing is training them on leadership to be able to participate in community affairs within their camps and what have you. So we train them on various leadership, we train them on various skills, we train them on issues of conflict advocacy.
وبعد ذلك تم إنشاء التحالف النسوي المدني للسلام، والذي تم خلال هذا التحالف إطلاق حملة أوقفوا الحرب واتحدوا معا لمواجهة COVID-19، والتي كانت عبر مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي سواء عبر السوشيال ميديا، تويتر، فيسبوك وما إلى ذلك، وساهمت فيها نساء التحالف النسوي المدني بشكل كبير في الحشد والمناصرة لكافة أطراف الصراع لإيقاف الحرب والاستجابة لكوفيد-19 من خلال توفير العديد من الجوانب التوعية عبر الحلقات الإذاعية النقاشية، وكذلك الحلقات الإذاعية التوعوية التي تناولت العديد من المواضيع مثل الجانب الآثار الاقتصادية لكوفيد-19 على المجتمع والآثار الاجتماعية كذلك.
متعدد داریم که یک قسمت ما توزیع مواد غذایی، بستای مواد غذایی بر مدت یک ماه برای خانواده‌های بی‌وضاحت و یا خانواده‌هایی که بیشتر آسیب پذیر دیدن، که میشه گفت زنان دارای معلولیت بیشتری آسیب پذیر دیدن، برای از ما بسته‌های غذایی توزیع می‌کنیم. بسته‌های صحی داریم به خاطر جلوگیری از افزایش کرونا.
كما ساهم المشروع بشكل كبير بحماية النساء المستضعفات كعاملات النظافة والسجينات والنساء النازحات بتوفير حقيبة حماية تحتوي على أدوات خاصة بالحماية مثل الكمامات والجليفزات والمعقمات وما إلى ذلك.
كونهم لسنا فقط متلقيات خدمة، بل يشكلنا جزء مهم وأساسي في مشهد مواجهة هذه الجائحة.
به خاطر که چون که نهادهای زنانه خود زنها به نهادهای زنانه بیشتر اعتماد دارن، چون که نهادهای زنانه بیشتر میتونن اوضاع احوال زنان بیشتر درک کنن، بیشتر میتونن فعالیت ها برای از اینا انجام بدن، و چون که خود تمرکز نهادهای زنانه سر بهبود وضعیت زنان.
ومن أجل تحسين وتجويد الخدمات المقدمة للنساء والفتيات، وخدمات تكون بتراعي الحساسية الجندرية وبتراعي سياسة النوع الاجتماعي، وصولا لخدمات بتستجيب لمعايير النزاهة والشفافية والملائمة لصالح النساء.
Para conocer las problemáticas, las violencias, las afectaciones de cada territorio, hay que conocer sus historias, hay que conocer sus afectaciones directamente, y qué más que las organizaciones de mujeres. Esto permite que sean las mujeres las que puedan proponer unas soluciones asertivas que realmente tengan un impacto y un cambio significativo en sus vidas y en sus territorios, y así poder lograr avanzar más en la equidad de género y en las condiciones de la vida de las mujeres.
Another thing is the fact that women are a socializing agent. You know, we socialize our children, just like women play a role in the issue of countering violent extremism, I also believe that women, based on their socializing, based on the way they interact with other people, are also tools for stemming the spread of COVID-19.
أنها تعمل على تعزيز الأمن الاقتصادي للنساء ووصولهن إلى الموارد، وتعمل على تعزيز مشاركة النساء في صنع القرار وبناء السلام والتخطيط ما بعد الصراع والانتعاش الاقتصادي.
پیام به دونرهایی هست که فعالیت ها خود بیشتر داشته باشن، بیشتر در قسمت ها کار بکنن، چون نظر به همین دوره کاری که ما داشتین، حذابیا داشتین، سرویایی که ما داشتین، متوجه شدین که خانواده ها آسیب پذیرتری از این هم وجود دارن. و من توقعم از نهادها دونرهایی است که بیشتر اجازه بدن بر مؤسسات فن بدن، اجازه فعالیت بدن، اونا حمایت کنن تا ما مؤسسات بتونیم به این افرادی که آسیب پذیرترین ها هستن بتونیم کار بکنیم.
Consideramos que las mujeres y las organizaciones de mujeres cumplen un papel muy importante para los cambios estructurales que se requieren en un país como Colombia, que es tan desigual, y que por lo tanto se le debe dar una importancia y un apoyo para que estas mujeres puedan visibilizar sus liderazgos, puedan mejorar sus territorios, puedan mejorar sus vidas.
It is a global pandemic. What happens in one area also affects the other one. So we need to join our hands together. It could be in form of funding. It could be in terms of technical support. It could just be in form of even this video that we are making, to spread the message around that together we can beat COVID-19.
في ظل الموجة الثانية لكوفيد 19 على اليمن، نتمنى من صندوق المرأة للسلام والعمل الإنساني وهيئة الأمم المتحدة للمرأة والمانحين الدوليين زيادة الدعم للمنظمات النسائية للاستجابة المحلية والوطنية لكوفيد 19 وذلك لضمان فعاليتها كونها تقدم فرصة كبيرة لإعادة البناء في هذا الوطن.
Thank you very much to our frontline responders for those very clear recommendations on what it is that they need in order to effectively deliver for their communities. And on that note, in terms of what we can do different, I would like to invite Gita El-Kari, who is the head of the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund Secretariat, to speak to the funding that the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund is providing and how that funding can offer some of the flexibility that women and their organizations are calling for. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I would like to thank all of our donors, partners, funding board members, and for their presence today and the expertise. I think it has been so far really great, sharing of knowledge among all of the speakers. So I think a lot has been said already. So I just very quickly want to tell you a little bit about this Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund emergency response window that we've been mentioning since the beginning of this event. So when COVID-19 hit, we immediately thought that we should do something about it. And the reason for that is because the fragility of the context where we're operating, of course, we thought that the pandemic was going to really accelerate the fragility of the context, but also have an increased impact on women and girls. But we also thought that we should do something because, as Mavic mentioned in the beginning, our partners are used to operate in crisis settings. That's what they do. We have already supported in the past some organizations that were doing Ebola response in some countries in Africa. So we really thought, okay, this is something that's relevant for the fund and its mandate. So what we have done is very quickly, and this was mentioned a couple of times already, as early as March of 2020, we conducted a survey with our partners, and they told us a lot of things, but I just want to focus on two. The first thing that they said is that they were well placed to respond, so that they confirmed that they thought that they were well placed to respond to COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on women and girls in crisis settings. But they also said to us that they felt their organization's existence was at risk, and 30% of them told us that they thought they were in danger due to shifting of funding priorities in the context of COVID-19. And that was the very beginning of the pandemic. So we based the design of the COVID-19 emergency response window together with the funding board of the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund on the results of this survey. So that's why we offered two main funding streams, a programmatic stream that meant to address the effects of COVID-19 on women and girls, more specifically in crisis settings, but also because organizations told us that they were thinking that they might disappear because of the crisis, we have opened for the first time a funding stream that provides exclusively institutional funding for women's organizations that don't necessarily engage in COVID-19 response. So some of them are also but women, peace and security organizations, more traditional, but that do not want to engage necessarily in COVID-19, but still needs to be supported throughout the crisis and survive through the pandemic. And I think that's also a part of the do no harm approach that we do. Just because the funding priorities are shifting, we do not need, we also need to support organizations that we have been supporting before, and so that they can sustain themselves throughout the crisis. So we launched in April 2020, and we started implementation as early as the spring of 2020. Sarah mentioned it in the opening, we have been supporting 44 projects across 18 countries. For our programmatic funding, more than half of the projects are focusing on women's leadership in the response. So for example, in Liberia, we have a project supporting a project that is increasing women's participation in all decision-making processes regarding COVID-19 response through coalition building from different civil society organizations and engagement advocacy between women and girls and government and state actors. More than half of our projects also focus on what has been called the shadow pandemic and on the gender-based violence dimension of lockdowns and the pandemic. And around 40% of our projects that we have supported are focusing on the economic impact of the pandemic and the lockdowns and the economic measures on women and girls. When it comes to the institutional funding now, we have been supporting 11 projects with organizations that have used the funding to just sustain themselves, pay for their staff, the rent, but also upgrade their working systems using IT technologies, moving online some of their services or their functioning methods. And a couple of some organizations that we have been supporting through institutional funding in Nigeria and Uganda, for example, have reported that they would have closed without this support. So what we have learned, and this has been said already, is that women's organizations are obviously well placed to respond. They have great reach, they have the knowledge, they have the expertise, and they also have the needs. The needs is there. We launched a call for proposal for 2 weeks in 25 countries. We have received almost 5,000 proposals. And when we provide them with the funding, when we have provided them with the funding, they really hit the ground running. Women's organizations always take an approach across the nexus. So what I was mentioning before, that they do both GBV, economic response, and also women's leadership and participation. That's an added value that unfortunately continues to be seen as a negative feature. And this is the reason why sometimes they're not getting the support that they deserve, because they're not doing just COVID-19 response. They also have a rights-based approach that addresses systemic issues when it comes to gender equality and humanitarian response and peace and security. And the third thing is that institutional funding is really key. It responds to a real need. We need it. It's a very good fit for crisis settings, and it needs to be sustained and duplicated and continued over time. So why should we continue to support them? One, because it works. We have a funding gap of $30 million to this emergency response window. And it was mentioned by Ambassador Arbiter in the beginning, and we have redone our survey in March 2021, and 84% now of the organizations report being at risk. So this is alarming. Women's organizations are being deprioritized, the shifting of funding is happening, and years of work and efforts supporting women peace builders and responders might be jeopardized and ultimately lost if we do not collectively do something about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gita. I will move us on from that to Madeleine Rees, who is the Secretary General of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And she will be taking us into the future around what the opportunity are for advancing gender equality and the women, peace and security agenda, linked to some of that important financing mechanisms that Gita was just pointing out. Madeleine, the floor is yours.
Hi, and thank you all very much for having me on this panel. I'm really, I don't know if I'm angry, frustrated, or just in one of those, we knew this was going to happen sort of responses, because when you said you're 30 million short, the fund is 30 million short of what it needs. Imagine $2 trillion going into that fund, which is just the military expenditure for last year. How did we get this so wrong? Do you remember when the pandemic started, we all started with the solidarity, we're all in this together, and basically we'll build back better. That phrase keeps coming up again. But the reality, as so vividly explained by the amazing interveners, is just so completely different. I mean, everything from the increase in military expenditure to the increase in violence, the erosion of rights, particularly social economic rights, and the ability to actually challenge governmental policies, because what the COVID pandemic has done is it's really shown that our problems are structural. That really, when we have violence of both the physical, economic, and then we have the lack of legal abilities to respond to that, note the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention by Turkey, for example, in the middle of a pandemic, we are leading to an erosion of the ability for women to participate. And you've only got to look at those governments who did do better during the COVID pandemic. And then it shows the importance of having women leaders and women actively participating in governance structures. And if we don't address the fault lines, we're going to reduce that ability to participate. And I think one of the things that's been very, very clear has been the failure of multilateralism. Where was the solidarity that was promised in terms of being able to support those who were doing the work on the ground? Where was and where is the support in vaccine rollout, in ensuring that basically the support that's needed, particularly from a gender perspective, is provided, and that the sorts of issues that have been vividly described today are surfaced internationally within and responded to, surfaced internationally and responded to. So I think there's two things going on that we need to address. There's the economic and there's the political. And I think it's brilliant that there is now this Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, because it gives direct support to women who need it on the ground. And then we step back from that a little bit, and we've got Spotlight, which is a broader initiative on addressing violence against women. So we have got our entry points within communities, but it is wrong for us to think that that is going to be a panacea. Why is it that the women who are actively engaged in holding communities together, who are the holders of social reproduction in countries, who actually have solutions to the really incredible problems that the world is facing now, coming with the solutions that we've heard today, and yet they're going to be dependent on a few donor governments giving it to a part of a UN organization in order to make that real. That's not enough. So as entry point, wonderful, Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund. Spotlight, doing the violence against women, good. Let's take it further. What we need is a community of actors, not just women helping other women with donor support. It's got to be the financial support from donors, from state-found states, and can I just, to the states on the call, we really have to look at taxation policies in order to make sure there is more money actually made available to give them the sort of support that is needed. We need to look absolutely at the securitization that's taken place during the pandemic and the amount of money that's gone into that as opposed to real human security. We've got to look at the way in which the international financial institutions work. That is where the structures come from in terms of the economics. So we need to make sure that the World Bank, the IMF and others who are engaged in investing do it from a gender perspective, actually use the resources to surface what it is that the women are saying need to be addressed. And that's structural. A different type of structural readjustment is what is needed, not going back to the old days, but one that is led by the sorts of people who are making interventions today who know what needs to be done. In order to make that work, you've got to have this emphasis on social and economic rights. That's where the political support comes in for legal obligations which already exist. So we call on member states not to do what they have been doing, which is actually eroding human rights in the face of pandemic, not to undermine principles of equality, which they've all signed up to, but to actually emphasize that as a way of actually building back differently. So we have finance, we have politics, and we have law. Make all three work, and they can. We've got our interventions, we do have a structure, we do still have the United Nations system, even if it has failed in its response so far. And if we do have that community of action to bring those together, to emphasize all the issues that have been brought out today and find solutions for them, which we can, there is no shortage of financing out there, it's just what it's spent for that is what needs to be changed. Then I think we could do something quite radical as a result of this pandemic, and that is to build back differently based on human security with real gender analysis at its core, front and center, to making the fundamental changes so that there will not be another pandemic, because we will have invested sufficiently in the environment, in our healthcare systems, in the sort of social support networks, which is so vital if we are in fact going to survive as a species, but more importantly, protect the planet. So that would be my heartfelt recommendations for us. We need to rethink what it is that we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madeleine, for those remarks, and reminder that if we don't make a commitment to those structural changes, we cannot ask the existing system necessarily to deliver differently to what it is doing today. Thank you. And with that, I would move us on to the closing session, and I will introduce Ms. Shilpa Pulela, who is counselor to the Australian mission to the UN and also one of the co-sponsors for this event. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for giving me the opportunity to make closing remarks today. It's been a fascinating hour listening to my fellow speakers share their thoughts. I think everyone before me today has demonstrated clearly that just as there can be no argument that women and girls are disproportionately impacted by COVID, those in conflict and crisis settings also face even larger hurdles in responding to COVID while simultaneously advocating for peace or managing crises. I agree with Mavic that this is where women, peace and security efforts are critical for an effective recovery. It's absolutely a crisis agenda, as you put it, Mavic. Women and girls in fragile environments are best placed to determine their own needs, and the evidence is clear that when they're fully included in decision-making processes, societies are more likely to prevent and resolve conflict. Just a couple of weeks ago, Australia released its second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. In this plan, we've identified 4 outcomes to guide our work, and I just wanted to touch quickly on 2 of these. Firstly, supporting the meaningful participation of women in peace processes, which I just mentioned, but which Geeta spoke more fully about in her presentation. And secondly, reducing sexual and gender-based violence. So many of the speakers today have noted the link between humanitarian emergencies on the one hand and the exacerbated levels of gender-based violence on the other. Just to add one more tragic statistic into the mix, in some crisis settings, no less than 65% of women report experiencing sexual or physical violence in their lifetime. This is twice as high as the global average, and it's unacceptable. So during COVID-19, Australia has been supporting our partners in the region to continue to implement the Women, Peace and Security agenda, including by tackling pandemic-related increases in gender-based violence. We can't do it alone, of course, and I wholeheartedly support all the comments that have been made about the importance of women's organisations in this space. They're truly the first responders, the eyes and hands on the ground, and they need our support as the pandemic continues into its second year. To that end, Australia's been very pleased to have been able to provide an additional $2.2 million to the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund this year to support further projects in Bangladesh and to establish a presence in the Philippines as well. We hope you see this as a sign of our confidence in the important work that you do. Finally, I just wanted to reflect quickly on Madeleine's presentation. I think despite the tragedy and suffering that the pandemic has created, there is an opportunity here. COVID has undoubtedly reversed progress on gender equality. And I agree with Madeleine that it's highlighted that current structures aren't fit for purpose to address these issues. But I hope that it has highlighted the situation in a way that policymakers or this community of actors that Madeleine referred to can't ignore. And I hope it compels everyone to do even more to redress this balance. It's made the case many times over, for example, for the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And I hope we don't lose that momentum as we come out of this crisis. Thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Shilpa. And we are a little bit over time. I just got a note here that we risk to be cut at any time. So I will hand over to Ms. Heike Thiel, Director for Civilian Crisis Prevention and Stabilization of the German Federal Foreign Office. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Dear Excellencies, delegates and representatives, and dear Rita, what I can say first, it is really wonderful to be here with you today again. And it has been worth every minute listening to the different experiences and ideas with this impressive group of like-minded and like-inspired. Our ambassador in Kinshasa, who recently visited some of the fund's projects in the Democratic Republic of Congo, he praised the fund as a unique instrument to strengthen women's organizations and to strengthen female leadership. I wanted to share with you this impression, which I fully sign as a statement, and would only add, it is exactly what we want. And it is good that this goal is visibly translated in field action. The video format with the frontline responders we have just watched, thank you to the Secretariat of the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund for this impressive work, spoke exactly about it. The fund has again proven to be one of the most responsive international mechanism to tackle emerging challenges. We all know that it's mostly women who do the essential but underpaid care work and also unpaid labor. The effects of COVID-19 have proven to be exceptionally difficult for women and women's organizations. Difficult to bring up their families, difficult to organize their daily life, and difficult for themselves. Unfortunately, violence against women and girls is increasing dramatically around the world during this pandemic. Let me be very clear. There is no peace and no security for women until all women can feel safe inside and outside their homes, inside and outside their families. Women and girls in humanitarian displacement and conflict settings bear the brunt of this pandemic even more. At the same time, women are at the forefront of this COVID-19 response, and we were witnessed by this small video we have just seen. Their activism and unwavering commitment is very inspiring. They need our support and funding as flexible as possible. This is why the emergency response window is more relevant than ever. The pandemic made it difficult for women's organizations to network, advocate, and get the visibility they deserve. So we are particularly grateful for the support the fund provides to those organizations. Events like the one today are a great opportunity for grassroots organizations to gain visibility, connect, and network. Germany has been an early supporter of the emergency response window. We contributed $3.5 million so far. The WPS agenda and its framework remain a strong and daily reminder. Its implementation, however, is often left behind the expectations and is especially threatened during this pandemic. That's why Germany has the ambition to be a strong partner of the fund and a proud supporter of this COVID-19 emergency response window. We must continue working on gender-sensitive responses to the pandemic. Let us defend the WPS agenda and strengthen its implementation, especially under these circumstances. I can only sing the same song as the Canadian speaker at the beginning. Women are powerful drivers of change to overcome the pandemic and realize the women, peace and security agenda. They deserve our strongest support. And yes, you're right, Madeleine, we must work on the structural challenges and build up a sustainable and powerful network of actors. By contributing together to the emergency response window, we do show solidarity and we do show encouragement to women and to women-led organizations during the pandemic. We owe this to the amazing activists, first responders, leaders, and human rights defenders who dedicate their lives to creating social cohesion and care and peaceful and safe life in their communities and societies in these difficult times. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Heike. And we are coming to the close of our event. I just wanted to bring together a couple of points that I think have echoed through the different presentations. The first, of course, is the critical role that women's organizations are playing at the front line of the response of COVID-19, and how despite this critical role, it often goes unrecognized and unfunded or poorly funded or not correctly funded. So I think we have a challenge here. Are we going to collectively contribute and step up to that challenge of actually doing things differently, not just building back better, but building back differently? And are we going to challenge ourselves also to open up spaces for women, their organizations and network, not only to participate, but to lead some of the changes that are required so we can fully ensure that human rights are fulfilled across the work that we are doing. It's been a pleasure to be here with everyone today. Thank you so much to Germany, Canada, and Australia for co-hosting this event with the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund. Thank you to all the speakers, the civil society partners, and participants. And most of all, thank you to all the women organizations and network that are leading the forefront of COVID-19 response and recovery across the world. Thank you and goodbye for now.